The liberal international order of the last century was a more or less stable system, defined by nation-states allied along ideological lines and administered by global institutions. Going forward, our fate may be legislated instead by a lattice of subnational collaborations, international corporations, NGOs, and global platforms that draw on distributed intelligence. These networks are barely mapped at all. They don't fit within the lines of any atlas, but they do shape our world. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. For decades, globalization promised us a stable, prosperous world by connecting nation-states through trade, diplomacy, and shared institutions. Goods, ideas, technology, and people moved smoothly across borders under the careful watch of powerful states. Today, power is increasingly shifting away from states and into networks of corporations and capital. Decisions that shape our planet's future happen behind closed doors, among a handful of people with unprecedented and unchecked power. 5 companies, Amazon, Apple, Google, Meta, and Microsoft, command more capital than any country on Earth, except 2, the United States and China. Our guest in this episode, Anne-Marie Slaughter, calls this emerging reality a multi-aligned world in which power no longer flows from states alone, but through webs of cooperation and conflict. Slaughter has spent her career navigating and influencing the highest levels of international relations and global governance, including serving as director of policy planning at the State Department under President Obama. She joined Berggruen Institute's co-founder Nathan Gardels on the sidelines of our planetary summit in Venice in October of 2024 to help us map this tangled world and explore pathways towards a truly planetary future. And now, Anne-Marie Slaughter and Nathan Gardels on Futurology.
So let me start with what now today appears a bit like ancient history, which is the mid-20th century.
Right.
Okay. So you were head of the policy planning department of the State Department in 2009, 2011.
Yep.
So that department is very famous, going back to George Kennan,
Indeed.
who conceived the idea of containment of the Soviet Union. So by the time you got there, 2019, there was a huge paradigm shift. The Cold War was over. We were no longer containing the Soviet Union. In fact, we were in those days still not quite enemies with Russia again.
Right.
So in some ways, it was the golden age of liberal internationalism. Well, okay, so you can answer. So I'm going to say, what is the essence? What is the essence of that, in your view, of that period? What did it accomplish? And then why did it break down?
Oh, my. So I think the place to start is with the creation of policy planning, because as you said, George Marshall created it as an in-house State Department think tank, and George Kennan was the first director of policy planning. And he came up with the Marshall Plan. He had been the architect of containment, but under George Marshall, they came up with the Marshall Plan. And George Marshall said to George Kennan when it was created, avoid trivia. And so that is the legacy and in many ways the burden all directors of policy planning carry, because you come in and you imagine this extraordinary group of people who transform the world as they did post-war. By 2009, when I came in under Secretary Clinton,
Hillary Clinton.
Yes, Clinton, right. Yes, Secretary Hillary Clinton, we were in an unusual place. As you point out, we're post-Cold War. We're now 2 decades past the end of the Cold War, or close to. We're just through the 2008 financial crisis, and the implications of that were not yet fully grasped. So the U.S. is still firmly in the driver's seat of the G20, of most global institutions. There's a strong sense, though, that the global issues, terrorism after 9/11, climate change. This is Obama. We're not thinking global health so much, but we are thinking about a deeply globalized system. And what is then what should be the focus of the liberal order? So I'm going to let me say just a word about what we tried to do, and then come back to the question of the liberal international order generally.
Okay.
For Secretary Clinton, what was absolutely critical was to elevate development. She came in saying there are 3 Ds. There's defense, diplomacy, obviously, and development. And if we look at the world, and of course, Secretary Clinton had really cut her teeth on international relations in President Clinton's administration when she traveled around the world, looked at the role of women globally, children. These were development issues. And for her, thinking about the health of humans around the world, the opportunity, the education, the jobs, all of that was just as important as geopolitics. And in 2009, I would say till 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine,
Right.
that seemed like those were the issues that we had to grapple with. And so when I was at policy planning, we did a lot to try to institutionalize a focus on development as much as diplomacy and defense, and to think about global networks.
Development meaning poverty reduction in the developing countries, or what?
Yes, although development really just means all the domestic policy issues we think about in the United States. From, again, if you think about that, that's going to be education, health, jobs, care of different kinds. Those are the issues you think about globally. You think about poverty reduction, but you also think about how do you, for instance, build telecommunications across the global South, right? And you might think similarly at the U.S., how do we get internet, to all the rural areas that don't have it? So it's really those human issues, whereas geopolitics is more the power politics of states. And that's how I think of it, is the human issues, the people issues, and then you think about the state issues, and the two coincide. So what does that mean if we think now for the liberal order, the post-1945 liberal order? Well, the first thing you think of is that that's an order for a world of 50 states or under 50 states. They imagined that the General Assembly wouldn't go above 60 to 70 states when they designed it. And so now we have this world of almost 200. And that global order was set up to take account of great power politics, of war and peace. I mean, if you read the UN Charter, it's really all about war and peace. There's a little bit about development. There's a lot about trusteeships, which was part of the colonial system. If you then fast forward, and let's start with 9/11, because the wall comes down in 1989. The early 90s, most of the 90s were kind of the heyday. The UN's working. The US and Russia are actually both voting more or less together. China is not a spoke in the wheels. So it really looks like the system's working. And then you have a tremendous amount of civil war, domestic upheaval, and then you have 9/11. And so I would say from 2000 until now, those issues of terrorism, pandemics, climate change, energy security, food security, water security, those issues are just as important as the geopolitical issues. And yet the global system, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's not set up to govern for those global issues, for those development issues in the way that it is for geopolitical issues, and it is broken down geopolitically.
And so I remember the financial crisis. Gordon Brown was Prime Minister of Britain. He had the G20, let's fix the world, the financial crisis, so it doesn't fall apart and there's global depression. And it seemed that there was a momentum, as you're already expressing, towards global cooperation.
Very much so.
Then you had 9/11, as you mentioned. Then you had this war on terror. But even in those days, the Chinese and the Russians, we were cooperating
Absolutely.
with them. So what happened then, because from that period of time, talk about paradigm shifts.
Yep.
So if we're back then when we're speaking about, the trajectory was towards the planetary. We're going towards not just a global integrated world, but a world that cares about climate change, a world that can move to a new planetary governance.
That's right.
That was the trajectory it seemed. Instead, we are now going the opposite direction towards nationalism, towards nativism, and it's really kind of a competition between paradigm shifts. It's like we thought we were going this way, those of us who, cared about the world, but it went the other way. So, is going further that way. So we have war in Ukraine, we have nationalist governments in Italy, in Hungary, illiberal democracy in the United States. So what happened? How come? And even the one thing we shouldn't forget, of course, is the pandemic, which at first seemed to be global cooperation. I remember sharing information, U.S. sharing information with the Chinese on the vaccine, and now it's all kaput. Protectionism, industrial policies. What do you think happened in that period? That was it domestically? I mean, it seemed that the other part of globalization that we didn't talk about, we talked about development and so on, but the inequality of global capitalism, the impact of trade and manufacturing leaving the Western countries and interacting with domestic politics. What are the factors there that you think kind of reverse the situation?
So the two biggest changes that happened between, say, 2009 when Obama comes in, and Obama is a deep multilateralist, and he's working through the United Nations, and he turned the G20 of the finance ministers into the G20 of leaders, all of that.
Right.
Until about certainly 2016 when Trump is elected, but I would say 2014 when Putin invades Ukraine for the first time. That is a real demarcation line.
Okay.
The two biggest changes in between 2009 and 2014 are the shift in Putin's view of the West and the rise of Xi Jinping and a very different vision of how China should engage with the world. So at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin basically threw down the gauntlet and said to all the assembled nations, mostly Western, look, you have taken Russia for granted, and we've had it, and we are a great power, and we are going to reassert ourselves as a great power. And you can see a real line between that 2007 and 2014, where effectively he thinks either the U.S. is distracted or, and I think importantly, we did not respond on the Syria red lines, right? Obama declared that using chemical weapons against your own people was a red line, and then Assad did it, and we didn't do anything. So for a combination of reasons, Putin is increasingly angry and increasingly determined to assert himself, and he invades Ukraine, and we don't do anything.
Right.
At the same time, Xi Jinping comes to power, and he is not Hu Jintao.
You mean he invaded Crimea at that time?
Yes.
We didn't do anything.
Well, he invades
before the full-scale invasion.
Well, but he invaded eastern Ukraine, right? He invades the Donbass, and he takes Crimea, which is huge. And at that time, just as in 2022, the Ukrainians are saying, and the Poles are saying, hey, wait a minute, this is undoing the post-war order. The post-war order is premised on sovereign and the integrity of borders and political independence. You don't change borders by force. Right. And he did. And we didn't do anything. We sanctioned him, but there was no big military pushback. Right. And so you have Putin essentially increasingly playing a in his view, a great power role, trying to restore the Soviet Union. That's what he's really about, and a spoiler role. And of course, in 2016, the Russians are manipulating the U.S. electoral system massively. So that's the first. And then again, Obama came into office believing in the responsible stakeholder view of China, which had been developed under George W. Bush. And it was, we will integrate China. And it was Clinton who wanted China in the WTO, and China will be a responsible stakeholder in the global system. And Xi Jinping sees what the West was counting on, which was increasing integration into the global system is going to lead to liberalization domestically. And he's not interested in that. He's interested in reasserting the power of the Chinese party. So by 2022, 2024, where we are now, you do have this shift back to great power politics with open aggression, with China and Russia in a partnership without limits, with Iran, North Korea, and other autocracies essentially once again pursuing their own interests in ways that trigger great power reactions. That's a paradigm shift back. But I think that return to great power politics has not stopped the shift to global politics. It's distracted us, and it needs to be addressed. But at the same time, if you look at what 150, 160 nations in the world are focused on, they are much more concerned about climate change, about the knock-on effects of climate change, energy security, water security. They're still deeply concerned about global pandemics. They're concerned about how they join the world of 21st century technology. And those two things are happening at the same time. It's just that if you are in the United States or Europe, you're still focused on the North. You're still focused on China and Russia. If you're in Latin America, Africa, Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, you're seeing a whole set of issues that were the issues we were focused on until we went back to focusing on our chief rivals. So I see the two as happening simultaneously.
I want to come back to how we negotiate this competition of paradigm shifts. I want to come back to that. But what you just gave me was really a perspective of the head of State Department planning about why things broke down. So if I'm in Russia and I'm Putin, not even Putin, Gorbachev. Okay. I knew Gorbachev well. I interviewed him all during those Cold War years. Gorbachev was the first to say, and he started Green Cross International, which was, a global ecological, like a Red Cross. That was his whole vision. Way before the invasion of Ukraine, even Gorbachev was saying, I was betrayed by the West. We sat there and we talked about Berlin, we talked about the unification of Germany, and it was not written on a piece of paper, but the clear understanding was NATO was not going to expand eastward. This is Gorbachev talking, not Putin. Okay? So there's that Russian perspective. Gorbachev was not going to invade another country, but he felt, I mean, his words, Russia's not getting the respect. Russia's a country of scientists, of educated people. We had new thinking, and the West has gone back. This was Gorbachev, okay? Then, let me go on Gorbachev, then I'll go to China. So there is that issue of NATO expansion and the different perceptions. And I guess what I'm trying to point out is not just Putin who says, I'm going to restore Kievan roots of Russia. Is actually the liberals of the West that we associated with who often thought the same thing. So is there any culpability on the side of the West for that breakdown? I don't want to dwell on this, but just...
No, I do think there's culpability. Both NATO expansion and the disastrous privatization of the Soviet state in ways that left ordinary Russians dramatically worse off, with a dropping life expectancy, with alcoholism, with, in many ways, if you look at the Russia of the 90s and you look at the deaths of despair of the United States in the teens and the 20s, you're seeing very similar conditions. So the NATO,
vodka and opioids.
What? Yes, yeah, no, vodka and opioids.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And I do think, if you imagine that the Cold War had come out the other way and that Russia wins, the Soviet Union wins, and that 10 years later, so by the late 90s, nobody's even talking about the United States as a player on the global stage, you'd have seen that reaction in the United States also. And that is what happened. I remember giving speeches on global politics in the late 90s and the aughts, and Russia we didn't even talk about Russia.
Right.
So I think there's a complicated but understandable reaction on the part of the government and the Russian people. With NATO, it's complicated. I think that is correct, that Russia did not expect NATO to expand. And if you think about the U.S. response to the Cuban Missile Crisis many years ago, but when we had missiles off our borders, we went completely crazy. You know, we were on the brink of nuclear war. No, Russia never expected NATO to come to its borders. At the same time, the U.S. didn't realize, at least initially when it was negotiating with Gorbachev, the disorder that was going to happen in Eastern and Central Europe after the fall of the wall, and this sense that you had to stabilize countries like Hungary and Poland and Romania, and you had the EU and you had NATO, and the EU is very slow. And NATO became the sort of extension of the promise of the West. So it wasn't. There were people like Zbigniew Brzezinski who said, we're going to move NATO as close and as far as we possibly can until the bear wakes up again. But there were many others, and I was one who really understood the danger it was going to do to U.S.-Russian relations, but also had these considerations. You know, the Balkans and Yugoslavia had fallen apart. The wars in the Balkans were horrific. And people like Richard Holbrooke were saying, if we can't expand NATO, we are going to have massive continuing violence in Eastern and Central Europe. So I see both sides.
So it goes both ways, because the Russians, from Putin to Gorbachev, said this NATO's a threat to us. But if the people of that newly independent country want to belong to NATO, that's a pickle. And you have the same pickle now. I don't want to get into this particularly, but with Trump in power and possible negotiation of Ukraine, do we want to go full-scale war, or do we want to make a deal because the West is exhausted from supporting? So I want to go to China, but I'll come back to that maybe. So now on China, again, you know, I was in China a lot in the days of Xi Jinping's rise and before, and Gorbachev again becomes a figure in that. So the U.S. says, China, you're a grown-up power now. You're growing up. You need to be a responsible stakeholder. And so China reads that as saying, okay, on your terms, you want me to join the world order. And we're no longer a poor country. We're a revived civilization. Now, I remember Fu Ying. You probably met Fu Ying, who was the Foreign Affairs Department of our Committee of the National People's Congress, who said in these days, she says, the West would never be satisfied that China's reforming until we have a Gorbachev. Until we have someone that does to China what Gorbachev did to the Soviet Union, the West won't be satisfied. So you had that pushback already, and that was before Trump and the trade war, the open trade war. So again, there's a Chinese side, like, okay, we'll be responsible on our terms, not just your terms. We're a major power. So all I'm trying to point out is that there are several dimensions to the breakdown of liberal internationalism, and it's resulting in a kind of, like you said, a backward paradigm shift to great power politics.
Yes. And I don't disagree with you about China either. I mean,
Yeah.
the United States, as a extraordinarily young country,
Right.
ridiculously young by the standards of so many other nations, has a very hard time understanding China not as a rising power, but as a returning power, as a power that was the power on the global stage for millennia.
Right, exactly.
And so for the Chinese, absolutely, you know, they are reclaiming what they see as their rightful place in the world.
Right.
And they are operating within the 1945 institutions.
Exactly.
They are winning friends and votes, just as the United States has always done. And the United States does indeed react very negatively when that is not integration on their terms. I think that is fair. I do also think, though, that Xi Jinping is a very strong leader who is a very strong communist leader in ways that his predecessors, really from Deng Xiaoping forward, were less so. He kind of goes back to Mao.
Yeah, absolutely. Ideology is more important
than... And he's willing to inflict real damage on the Chinese economy and on the Chinese technology, at least from the perspective of sort of a global China, to do it. But yes.
Well, before we leave this topic, I want to go back again to the negotiation between the competing paradigms, or how do you negotiate that? But both China and Russia, and some other countries, but they're the ringleaders. They've gone beyond. China still says we like the international system. That's how we just want to be in charge, or we want to be at the top table, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, they're changing the way that they are looking at the world, Russia and China, namely calling themselves civilizational states. That we are not just powers like normal. Even have an alliance. They have an alliance of civilizational states, which says all civilizations develop by their own history, you mentioned millennium of Chinese history. Putin goes back to the Kievan Rus, the Christianization of and unification of Russia back during
Russian Orthodox,
Tsar Nicholas, the first Tsar Nicholas,
right?
First Tsar Nicholas.
There were many.
So, do you give any credence to this civilizational argument that basically now we're back in power, but it's not just power politics like led the First World War? We're actually civilizational powers. Do you give any credence to that? It's kind of the Sam Huntington argument about civilization conflicts, but they're deploying it as part of their view of the world, mainly saying we're different. So they're not saying, it's not like the old days where we're communists in Russia and we're communists in China, so therefore we're allies. We are different civilizations, just like they're all out of different civilizations, and the West just wants to lord it over everyone. So we're resisting on that basis. Do you give any credence to that?
I don't give it any credence as an organizing principle for the world we're in. I think it is highly convenient for both of them because they are both states that are big enough that the civilizational lens is also a nationalist lens.
Right.
You can't do that in Europe because the civilizational lens extends all over Europe. You can't really do it in Africa either because again, the great civilizations of Africa, or indeed in Latin America, which is more complicated with the indigenous civilizations, they're not coterminous with the states. So I see that as these are ways of galvanizing their people. These are ways of telling their people that they stand for a great tradition, which certainly is felt among the people. So it's a way of really whipping up strong nationalist sentiment. I don't think it's a way that you're going to be effective on the world stage, except the Iranians. They certainly can do that. The Indians can do that, although India, again, is so diverse. And so there are many different civilizations there and there are different religions. So there are a couple states, Iran is the other one that certainly comes to mind. But I again see it mostly as a way of consolidating domestic power. And
perhaps legitimating their rule, not by democracy or people sovereignty,
Yes.
but by the continuity
Yes.
of their civilization. It
Yes.
gives them if you go to a meeting in Beijing in the Great Hall of the People, there's a big mural of the great, of the Forbidden City and the Great Wall and all the history behind. And when Putin met Xi in Moscow, it was in the Kremlin with the murals of the sons and the lineage from Tsar Nicholas. Anyway,
although the Chinese, I'll just say that, the Chinese great history is also a history of being invaded and then absorbing the invader. So it's not as if, there was the Han Chinese all the way through. The Han Chinese are constructed of many, many different outside forces as well.
Okay, so let's go back to the competition between these paradigm shifts. We were on a trajectory from liberal internationalism to global integration, climate change, pandemics, some kind of planetary understanding of cooperation. But we've gone then the other way, which we are today, is kind of a nationalist revival. So how do we reconcile those two things? Now, you've written, and there are many ways to talk about this, subnational networks of the willing, not nation state to nation state, but cities to cities, states to provinces. You talked about the role of America, seeding, not leading, seeding with seeds, like
with
planting
an
seeds.
S-E-E, not C-E-D.
Make that clear. S-E-E-D. That could be,
yes.
Yeah, that has to be clarified. Seeding, not leading, multi-alignment. So in this kind of forming block system where you still have this large sentiment and in some sense momentum towards global cooperation, you've kind of got two levels. So how can we reconcile these networks of willing?
So the first thing to say is that this, again, is both and. I would start with the 2022 Biden national security strategy that says for the very first time for a U.S. national security strategy that the geopolitical threats of, again, China, Russia, our adversaries, Iran and North Korea are the ones they focus on, but the geopolitical threats are very much there and have to be addressed, and you need a strong military and a strong economy, traditional markers of power to address them. That's there. And then what they call transnational challenges, I would call global threats or planetary threats. But again, climate change and infectious disease and terrorism and the threats to our food and water. Those threats are equally important. So that you have to start with this idea that you've got both things happening at the same time and you have to address both at the same time. And they're often quite contradictory because we need China. If we're going to address global warming, well, we absolutely have to cooperate with China. And yet if we're going to push back on Ukraine, to take just one example, well, then we're pushing back against China. So these are very, very complicated. The way I argue we need to address it, and that's true whether Biden's president or Trump is president, even though Trump will probably take a different view of what's important, is that you see the 1945 geopolitical system, the system of states. I see that system as increasingly making room for middle powers as well as great powers. And a lot of those middle powers are going to put their own interests on the global agenda and their interests. Now, again, I'm talking India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, lots and lots, or Turkey is another good example of states that are powerful. They're more powerful regionally than globally, but they're powerful enough to build coalitions and make things happen. That's the shifting geopolitical system. At the same time, so think about this. I often think about this as a globe with all the states on it, all those colored blocks. that globe is simultaneously crisscrossed by networks of all different kinds. And those are mayors or governors, during 2016 to 2020, California made deals with Canada and Mexico.
And China.
And China.
Yeah.
And many U.S. states, right,
Yep.
have trade delegations to China, to other states. So you have governors, you have mayors, 7,000 mayors in the Global Covenant of Mayors, the C40, which is now like the C200 of big cities working on climate change. But also, of course, if you're thinking about just take pandemics or climate change, either one, lots of companies, lots of CEOs who believe, we have got to be focused on emissions reductions, clean energy, the transition to clean energy, regardless of what the governments say. Again, cities and states, enormous numbers of philanthropies, enormous numbers of think tanks and universities and the scientific establishment, faith groups. So you can map the world in terms of networks of all those different actors, and that is planetary. It is global. It transcends and crisscrosses those sovereign entities, and we have to simultaneously think. Yes, there are nation states engaged in geopolitics. And there's this global or planetary political system. I think global is easier for most people to think about because those are also the networks of globalization that are, again, around through alongside the states. And that's hard because we're accustomed to having the state view of the world, and now we have to have this global view at the same time.
I remember some things you've written recently. One is don't wait for the state.
Yes.
So that's kind of what's called the global civil society networks, the businesses, the mayors,
all those.
Don't wait for the state, meaning the national state. You can do things like China. California has loads of climate projects with China.
Yep.
We've actually even both under Governor Brown and under Governor Newsom, we have sought to integrate our carbon trading markets. Yeah. So it's been very advanced, and it really took off when Trump came to power the first time and pulled out of Paris.
Yep. Exactly.
So we continued to do things with China. So that's the don't wait for the national state. The other side is, as you mentioned, now you have all of these states, and they're not all in one camp or another.
Exactly.
And so they can combine in different ways. So you call that multi-partner or not multipolar. That's right. Different. Explain the difference, the distinction.
That's right. So I actually quote from a speech that Hillary Clinton gave in 2009, where she said, we need to move from a multipolar world, which is your classic great powers that, you think of the concert of Europe with maybe 4 to 6 great powers who are all jockeying for advantage and making alliances of different kinds. Multipolar world to a multi-partner world where those partnerships, they can be states. Absolutely. You might say the BRICS is a partnership of China and India and Russia and Brazil, South Africa. So you could have partnerships of states, and many of those, again, are going to be smaller states, middle powers, smaller powers. You can have, the partnership of small states working on tech or working on climate issues. But you can equally have partnerships between, again, certainly provinces or states of the United States, not nation states, and cities, and business and civic groups in ways that if you think about global health, for instance, an organization like Gavi, which is dedicated to immunizing hundreds of millions of children, that's something the Gates Foundation created. It includes the World Health Organization, it includes the EU, other states, but it also includes pharmaceutical companies, NGOs who deliver vaccines around the world, and any entity can start one of those kinds of partnerships. It could come from business. It could come from philanthropy. It could come from small states. But the point is to create partnerships that actually deliver. So you look at a partnership, again, in health or in climate or in the energy transition or in clean water. There's any one of the big global problems we face can be addressed by these partnerships. The other key thing, though, here is that that multi-partner world is what the Indians would call a multi-aligned world.
Right.
And what they mean by that, India's foreign secretary, Jaishankar, said when he was asked, when he was told, really, you have to choose between the West and Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. You're a member of the Quad, that's Japan, Australia, India, and the U.S. You're a U.S. ally in that sense, not formally. And Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the West is lined up on the side of Ukraine. You have to choose. And Secretary Jaishankar said, we've chosen India. And he has pioneered this idea of multi-alignment, which means India is going to buy energy from Russia because it needs energy from Russia, and it's going to also caucus with Japan and Australia and the U.S. Against China, or just in general to stabilize the Indo-Pacific. But they're not going to be East or West. They are going to be multi-aligned. So I think that that world of global issues is a multi-partner world and a multi-aligned world. Couldn't be further from this idea of democracies lined up against autocracies or a couple of great powers ruling the rest of the world.
Yeah, I'm wondering how. So what we're basically describing is a distributed world order.
Yes,
it's distributed among nation states. It's distributed among civil society.
That's exactly right. Business.
Now, the paradigms that rule the world come from when great powers shape the big picture.
Yes,
and that's not the case. So it's I don't know if you want to call it chaos, distributed. You know what I'm saying? It's hard to congeal. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, said the masses are an impotent diaspora without a Leninist party. So this is like a distributed diaspora. Will it add up to dealing with climate change? Will it add up? I don't know. You can answer that question. Anybody can, but that seems to be. It doesn't cohere at some level.
It is definitely a distributed world order. There are still many elements of order. So it's not chaos. One way of thinking about it would be, so it's multipolar at the geopolitical level, but it's multi-partner at the level of global threats. It's multi-aligned in terms of there are lots of different ways you can partner. I would also say it's multi-hub. So if you think about this more like the internet than the United Nations.
Okay.
And the internet is deeply horizontal. There are huge powers within it, unlike the early days of the internet when we imagined that there would be a kind of broadly equally distributed set of platforms and companies. Quite the contrary, we got a number of really big platforms and then the long tail of anybody else who wants to join. So you can think about that as a space where there are a number of really big hubs, and they do anchor power and reach within the internet. Many of us would like to change who they are, but it's still, and then there's lots of opportunity for many, many smaller players. I think that's the way we're going to have to reimagine global order. Now, again, you can think about that geopolitically. You can think, well, wait a minute, there's the EU, there's the African Union, there's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, not so much in Latin America or the Americas, but they're going to be regional organizations. And then you can think in different areas, in climate or health or energy, They're going to be different big hubs,
Mhm.
but there will be hubs that are recognizable and able to provide power, resources, stability
Mhm.
in different regions and on different issues. That's still really messy. But I think for lots of young people who are accustomed to a world that is much more horizontal and much more fluid and flexible than the kind of hierarchies certainly the boomers grew up
Mhm.
with,
Mhm.
it's not as hard to wrap their minds around as it might be for many of us.
Okay. Let me shift from the globe and the world and the planet to literally domestic life, family,
Yep.
so on.
Yep.
So you were famous writing an article in The Atlantic, which I believe the title was "You Can't Have It All."
So I wrote this article in 2012. I had come out of the State Department and had not stayed in as I thought I would do or gone back in. Later, I didn't go back in. And I didn't because I had teenage sons at that point, and one of them was making really bad choices. And I ended up making a choice I never expected to make, which was to leave what was a dream job. And I'd always expected to go in and out of the State Department, and I could have stayed in and risen. And there were only really fabulous jobs above where I was. And instead, I chose family. And the article was, even with all the ambition and privilege and resources in the world, which I had,
Mhm.
I ended up making a choice for family, and it was the right choice.
Mhm.
And our world is not set up to enable people to do that. Women are more likely to make those choices, although plenty of men have actually also made those choices. It just doesn't get highlighted. And so we still need to make a lot of changes if we expect women to be able to have the mix of career and family that men have had. That was what I was arguing. It was widely misunderstood as women can never have it all.
Uh-huh.
It did take on what at that point was Sheryl Sandberg's commencement address to Barnard, which was where she first talked about lean in. And her argument, which I don't think she'd make today, was, it's just about ambition, determination, taking your place at the table. Um, but I think she would agree with me now. Life happens. People divorce. In her case, her first husband died.
Mhm.
You have a child with special needs. Your husband has to move. There's so many factors that mean somebody's got to be caring for family members. That is traditionally women. It ought to be both of us.
Mhm.
And that means instead of just having this world where we think if we just manage our time enough and we're super women enough, we can make it, we need to adapt our workplaces, our social security systems, our economic and social policies to a world in which the need to take care of people, to provide care, to be anchors for families is as valued, and we make as much room for it as we do for career. I didn't argue all of that in 2012. Some of that has evolved since, but that original article created just a huge rekindling of the conversation about work and family, mostly because you had a lot of millennial women who were saying, this isn't working for me, and I want to make different choices.
Well, as that was happening, and there's a broader social shift taking place, you had, again, you take the broad frame going back decades. So women getting to the workforce to begin with, then women being ambitious, women standing up, making the choice between career and family. Then you got the social movement behind that, which diversity. So not just white women, everybody, equity, inclusion.
Right.
You got this whole movement towards that, which now you're having a reaction to that, which is you can talk about Italy, Giorgia Meloni, you can talk about Hungary, Viktor Orban, you can talk about J.D. Vance, family, faith, and nation. The whole secular liberalism thing, the equity and inclusion, now you have a kind of a cultural pushback. So here too, we're seeing a global shift. We're seeing a shift within societies. And who knows where that's going to shake out, I guess. Are we going to see the same thing? Basically, we're going to see some people like this, some people like that, and all somehow living together in a distributed family forms, distributed, you know what I'm saying?
The shifts in the global order and the kinds of domestic shifts that are leading to right-wing populism and some left-wing populism, but mostly on the right, in countries around the world are connected in that we are all at the mercy of massive changes. Changes that we have not seen since the Industrial Revolution, with climate, changes on a planetary scale. If we're in the Anthropocene, we are now able to, human beings are making changes that are affecting the planet. So but at the same time, we're in a moment of massive demographic change, and some of those are connected. In the United States, the demographic changes through immigration. That was the result of our actual policies welcoming immigrants from 65 forward. In Europe, where you see lots of populism, that's immigration that is a function of wars in Afghanistan and Syria and poverty in Africa, but also climate migrants.
Right.
And so you're seeing a backlash against, wait a minute, who are all these people coming in? We're going to preserve our culture. In the United States, you're seeing the same thing. We're within 20 years, the United States will no longer have a European American majority, a white majority, although white.
California's already like that.
California.
We're majority minority, Asian and Latino, basically.
I mean, essentially, I prefer plurality because if there's no majority, there's no minority. So you have technological changes, you have global changes, and you have demographic changes. And that, both globally and domestically, that creates a lot of fear. And where you have that kind of fear, strong men, strong women can flourish. But it's also just this sense of being, what do you hold on to? It's not uncommon in that situation to look back to an imagined past.
Right.
And so a lot of the backlash that you're seeing in the United States is this really quite imagined, let's go back to the 1950s where you had men were men, women knew their role. It was actually a terrible time from my point of view, not just for women, but certainly for people of color, a time of far less opportunity. But there's this sense that, well, we knew what was what. I think the backlash is there. It's perfectly predictable, again, given the amount of change. But I don't think I think the kind of identity politics on the one hand and MAGA on the other is actually only capturing about 20% of people on either side, the sort of extreme right and extreme left. There are a huge number of people in the middle who are perfectly happy to live in a far more diverse society. But they want jobs, they want housing, they want sort of safety and security, whether that's from natural disaster or technology taking their jobs. And that, at least in the US, I won't speak globally, our political system is not allowing us to create the parties that would actually have much more in common and be able to move us forward. And we're trapped with this sense of one set of groups are focused on issues that are not capturing a majority, and another extreme group is trying to drag us back to a place that I really don't think a majority of Americans want to go.
Yeah, so it's a little bit like the multi-alignment and multi-partner
A bit,
at the
yes.
global level.
We need much more room for
and
multiple
a two-party
parties.
system
Yes,
forces
that's
everyone
true.
to a zero-sum
Exactly.
Procrustean box.
Exactly.
So one of the big movements, and I'll end here, to deal with that, is these kind of citizen assemblies,
Yeah.
which have been used in Europe, where you bring together citizens indicative of the public as a whole in a neutral space outside of an electoral arena, expose the facts, can call on, like in a jury, call on experts to context and information, and then makes a decision outside of a partisan framework on some issue.
Yeah.
So they may say, gay marriage is fine, but we don't like pre-adolescent hormone treatment.
Right.
And that's more where this public in the middle,
right,
what Richard Nixon used to call the silent majority, is.
Yes.
So I suppose we can end by saying maybe we need a new Richard Nixon.
No, no.
A new Richard Nixon, not Nixon per se, but a silent majority, which could come from the citizens themselves.
So yes, and More in Common, the research group More
Yep.
in Common, calls that the exhausted majority, and they have all this work around hidden tribes where they actually do go way beyond Democrats and Republicans
Right.
to show you they're more or less sort of 8 groups across some kind of spectrum. I think the way I would end on a hopeful note is that these citizen assemblies, which absolutely bring people together, and they often use processes that help people see that they in fact agree on much more than they think they do. Because one way that politicians manipulate this kind of fear and division is to get people to think the other side is totally other, not we agree on 50% of the
Right.
issues and we disagree on some, we don't agree on anything. When citizens come together, they realize, no, actually, there is a whole area of agreement, and disagreement can be actually deliberated about and resolved. So in a way, if we think about this chaotic, disordered, horizontal world in which people feel disempowered and are not sure where to turn, if they look locally and they realize, no, we can start by at least addressing local issues, and we can address global issues locally. We can think about, what is our resilience plan? What is our health system plan? How are we thinking about welcoming immigrants in our town? Whatever the issues are, and it could also be gender issues or sexual orientation issues. That gives people, again, a hub. It gives people a place to come together and anchor that then helps them think about that broader world. So here I would say, think about kind of a quilt, that has hubs in various places. And I do believe that citizen assemblies can help people believe that democracy can work. And if it can work locally, then we can reinvigorate it, both first at the state level and then ultimately the national level, maybe at the regional and maybe even at the global level.
Thank you, Anne-Marie Slaughter. You're eminently sensible.
I'll take that. Thanks so much.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardels, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardels, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.